Today, I have decided to teach you Flexbox. Flexbox is a very powerful layout tool in CSS. So if you want to build a simple website or a complex web application, learning Flexbox will give you the control you need to create responsive and modern layouts. In this course, you will learn each and everything you need to know about Flexbox, from the basics to more advanced concepts. This course is very practical and we learn everything by doing. One big advantage of taking this course is, in the end, we'll try to put everything together and create a Flex layout. And that simply means this course has a project. Yes, we will see the practical implementation of all the concepts. My name is Sala and I am the person behind the scene. Now, without any further delay, let's dive into it. The first thing first, we need to get some background and to learn some terminologies. What is Flexbox? Flexbox means flexible box layout. It's a CSS technique that helps you to lay out items in a container and give you more control over alignment, spacing, and distribution of the items. Right? So using Flexbox, we can easily control alignment, spacing, and distribution of HTML elements. So to create a layout, we actually need these three things: better alignment, spacing, and distribution. CSS Flexbox provides all of them. Before Flexbox, it wasn't so easy to arrange HTML and to create layouts. In the past, we had been using tables and float for the arrangement and the distribution of the HTML. Today, layouts using float and tables are considered old-fashioned. And to make these layouts responsive is not an easy job. So the Flexbox is a better choice. CSS Grid is another option for creating layouts. So once you're done with the Flexbox, I would recommend go further, go ahead and learn CSS Grid. So it's good to learn both. CSS Flexbox is a one-dimensional technique, whereas CSS Grid is two-dimensional. Now, before we move on to the next slide, you see the term container is marked blue. So why is that? There is a reason. The term container is a key term in the CSS Flexbox module. Everything goes around the term container. You will learn more about it in the coming slides and the rest of this course. So just remember this thing. Container is a key term. Flexbox terminologies. Okay, this part is very important and I want you to listen very carefully. While working with the Flexbox, we continuously use two terms: flex container and flex items. A flex container is a HTML element that holds HTML items. What does it mean? A container, a flex container, is nothing but an element, just a HTML tag. And the flex items are also HTML tags, which are inside the flex container. So there are only HTML elements. The one is container and the others are items. Flex items are direct children of the flex container. And we create a flex container using display flex property. It will make more sense when we look at an example. So let's have one. Now you see some HTML on the screen. And what do we have here? We have a container with a class header. And inside the container, we have 5 HTML elements. We have 2 divs, an image, and 2 menus. So now to convert this header container into the flex container, we'll apply display flex on it using the CSS. So as soon as we apply display flex on the container, all its direct children will become flex items. So these 5 elements which we have inside the container will convert themselves into the flex items because they are direct children of the container. So a flex container is just an HTML element, outermost HTML element, and the flex is applied on it. So in a nutshell, we can say Flexbox aligns, controls spacing, and distributes flex items which are inside the flex container. Don't worry if you are confused at this stage. There is a lot to come. Just follow along. Now, as we know, Flexbox consists of two things: flex container and flex items. So in the Flexbox system, we have a bunch of properties for both of them. Flex container has its own properties which can only be applied on the container, as well as flex items have their own properties which can only be applied on the items. So to learn this flexbox technique, all you need to do is just learn these properties and you are done. So these are the properties we have in the flexbox system, and we are going to learn them thoroughly one by one. We will first cover the container properties and then move on to the items properties. For the container, we have flex direction, flex wrap, justify content, align items, align content, gap, row gap, and column gap. And for the items, we have order, flex grow, shrink, basis, and align cell. So we are going to cover these properties in the same sequence or in the same order that you see here. The timeline of this video is beautifully divided. Check the description for more details. You can simply jump from one property to another by clicking on the details provided in the description. Okay, so my dear listeners, it's about time. We have necessary background to start with the Flexbox. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and leave a comment under the video. Let's get started with the Flexbox. In order to write and organize code, we need a code editor. I'll be using Visual Studio Code in this course, but it's not necessary that you should also be using Visual Studio Code. You can use any editor you like. It won't make any difference as long as you're working with the HTML and the CSS, right? So now, to get started with the code, we need some files. We need a HTML file and a CSS file. So let's create both the files one by one. Both the files are created, and now I will put them side by side so that we can better understand the interaction between the code. Now, in the HTML file that we have to the left side, I will drop the HTML template and change the title to CSS Flexbox. And at the same time, I will link my CSS file to the HTML, right? So we have HTML file, template, and the CSS is also linked. And now we just need to run this file, this HTML file in the browser so that we could study the output of our code. Here's the file. Let me double click on it. And here we go. Our HTML file, index.html in the browser. So our coding environment is set up. Let's move on. In the CSS, I will simply do a reset in the universal selector. I will remove unnecessary padding, margin, and will set box sizing to border box. This reset is not required for this tutorial, but it's always a good practice to start with it. Simply remove the unnecessary padding and margin which are associated with the HTML elements by default. It will save you from a lot of troubles when you lay out your elements. Now we move on to the HTML and we'll set up two different containers with some children. Let's take a div container with a class header, and inside that div, I will create three more divs with a class flex item 1, 2, 3. So now we have a container which has three children and all of them are div. Empty divs have no appearance in the browser, so that's why we need to put some content in them. So let's say in the first div, we will say item 1, item 2, and item 3. Now we'll take another container and call it nav. And inside that container, I will place three navigations. So here we have our simple HTML to start with. We have two containers and they have their own children. The children of the first container are block elements. Div is a block element, whereas the second container, which is now has inline children. I did that on purpose so that you get better understanding of different flex properties. In the browser, you will see the default static placement of the HTML. Static placement is the default placement of the HTML, where the block element always starts with a new line. So you can see we have three divs in our HTML and they start on a new line. The inline elements, on the other hand, do not start on a new line and they only take up as much width as necessary. And that's why you see they sit on a single line. So it's a default static placement of block and inline HTML elements. Now we'll put some more CSS before we code Flex. I just want to give these divs a different background color so that we can easily relate and understand the behavior of different Flex properties. Right, so let me do that in the CSS. Very simple CSS. The event children of the header container will become light blue and the odd will become light green. And there is some padding applied to all of them. And that should be the output. Now we can see the size of the divs as they become more prominent in the browser because of the background color. Now we are good to go. And it's time for the flex. Remember what I said earlier. Flex is applied on the container so that we can control the spacement, alignment, and distribution of the items which are inside the container. So let's focus on the first block of code here. So if I want to control the alignment or the spacing of these three divs, I must apply flex on the header container. And at that very second we apply flex on the container, all its children convert into the flex items. That means they will not longer be statically positioned in the browser. They will become flex items and then the flex can control their positioning. Now in the CSS, I will simply select the header container like this, which is gonna become a flex container, right? So I will just put a comment here, flex container. So to convert a normal container into a flex container, we use display flex property, like I said earlier. This single line of code actually do all the magic. Converts the container into the flex container and the children to flex items. When I refresh the page now, you will see a different behavior. These three divs gonna arrange themselves in a single row. Let's refresh the page and here you see the output. You see elements are not statically positioned. They are flex items now and flex is controlling them. When we activate flex on a container, the flex direction property, which is also the first property in our list, and that property is a container label property. So flex direction property is always set to row by default. And that's why you see such a result. All the items in a single row. And there will be no difference between the block flex items and inline flex items. All of them will arrange themselves in a row as soon as we activate flex on the container. So once the flex is applied, you can control the direction of the elements or the flex items using the flex direction property. The default value of the property, like I said, is row. If you want your item on a single row, then you don't need to call this property. You can just ignore it like this. Now the row arrangement has another value which is called row reverse. Row reverse will totally do the opposite and will start placing the flex items from the right to the left. Uh, the row usually place the items from the left to the right, right? And the row reverse will do exactly the opposite. Now, as I refresh the page, you will see the first flex item gonna put itself here to the right side. And the second flex item will come right after that and the third one. So let me reload the page and now you see the result. So to place items on a single row, you have only two different options, row and row reverse. What I told you before, Flex is a one dimension system. That means at a time, you can only work with a single dimension or the direction. For example, row is the direction or the dimension. You choose it and you start working with the flex items. The other direction that we have in the flex system is column. So there are only two dimensions. or two directions, row and column. But we can't work with both of them at a time. That should either be row or column. So as we choose the direction column, flex items gonna arrange themselves vertically like a column. As I reload the page, you will see our divs are arranged in a column, right? So that is flex direction column. And we also have column reverse, just like row reverse. So when you apply column reverse, our flex items gonna arrange themselves in the reverse order. That means item 3 will be at the top of the column and item 1 at the bottom. So instead of column, we can also choose column reverse to reverse the arrangement of our flex items. Now you can see the items are still in the column, but their order is totally reversed. That was our first container level property, flex direction. And now you have seen only this single property gives us several different options to place the flex items. The next property on our list is justify content. Justify content is probably the most used flex property. This property controls the spacing or distribution amongst the flex items. So let's see how do we use this property. I will first put the flex direction back to row and we'll make another improvement, a background color to the flex container. A background color on the Flex container at the time when we are learning will help us a lot to understand how things are happening in the browser. Justify content, like I said earlier, is a container property that gets used a lot. It controls the spacing between the elements and can take 6 different values. And those values are flex start, flex end, center, space between, space around, and space evenly. The value flex start is the default value. When the direction is set to row, the elements are placed to the left side. So let me show you justify content flex start. As I reload the page, you won't see any difference. This start position in the flex container is flex start. Flex end is the right positioning inside the container. So as we change the value from flex start to flex end, you see the difference. So let me reload, and here you see the positioning of the alignments of the flex items. Now the third value is center, and that value lets you center flex items exactly inside the container. We have been using different tricks to center align HTML, but now things are much easier. Justify content center can center align one or more elements without any problem. Now we'll apply justify content center to elements. So as I reload the page, you will see all the elements are center aligned exactly inside the container. So center alignment is not a big deal any longer. And it won't be any problem how many children do you have. If you have only one children, that will be center aligned. So let me show you. I deactivate the divs, and now we have only one div, which is also the flex item. As I reload the page, you will see a single div, which is center aligned, right? And instead of the div, you can place any HTML element to the center of the page horizontally with the help of flex. You can have image, form, list, etc. So let's activate the div again. And now we have another value, store space between. Space between is also very interesting. It distributes the item inside the container. So if you have 3 items like we have in our code, the first one is placed to the flex start, last one is flex end, and this one will be in the middle of the container. So let me reload the page, and here we see the result. Now you see the distribution of the space among the elements. And if I had only 2 items, then one would be at flex start and the second one would be at flex end. And just like a space between, we have a space evenly and space around. And there isn't much difference between them. It's all about how the space is distributed among the elements. Evenly simply means the space is evenly distributed among all the elements. As we reload the page, you can see the space inside the container is evenly distributed among the elements. And in the last, we have space around. So let me show you very fast the output of this value. Reload the page, and here's the output. So here space around the element is equally distributed. We studied justify content when the flex direction is set to row. And what if when the direction is set to column? In this case, the justify content property becomes more interesting. So let's have some fun with the justify content property when the flex direction is set to column. But before that, we need to change the orientation of our flex container. And there is a very logical reason for that. Just have a look here. When we work with the direction row, our working plane is horizontal. And here we already have enough space to distribute amongst the item. You can see the light coral color in the background is a container, our flex container. However, to distribute items vertically, we don't have any space in this container. We need to set up some height to the container so that we have some space to deal with. Coming back to the code, and here we apply an height to the container. Let's say height is 400 pixels. And at the same time, I will apply a width and height to my divs to make them look like boxes. So select all the divs, width 100 pixels, and height also 100 pixels. As we reload the page, so you can see our flex container in the background, and this is the size of our divs now. And now we have enough space on our vertical plane to deal with. So when the flex section is set to column, then justify content flex start is actually this point, top left corner, and justify content flex end would be the bottom of the container. Don't mix it up with the row direction. In the row direction, items are moved left and right. However, in the column direction, items are distributed or moved between top to bottom. So now we change the direction to column, and justify content is flex start. So like I said, flex start gonna place the items from the top left corner. So let me reload, and here you see the items. And when we change the content value from flex start to flex end, then the items will move to the bottom of the container. So let me refresh, and here you see the movement. And now we have justify content center. The center value gonna center these flex items vertically on this plane, right? So everything is on the vertical plane. So let me change the value to center and refresh, and here you see the output. Our columns are exactly vertically center aligned, right? So using direction row and justify content center, you can horizontally align your items. And when the direction is column and justify content is set to center, you can vertically center align your items. And now we have space distributing values, space between, around, and evenly. So let me show you the output of space between. You can then check yourself the output of space around and evenly. Let me refresh, and so you see the output. The first is at flex start, flex end, and the third one is in the middle. Space around and evenly going to work the same way. It's only the distributed amount of space is different. That was justify content property we just studied. Let's move on. We have a bunch of other properties left to cover. The next property on our list is flex wrap. It will let you create a flex container which is little bit responsive. So what does flex do? By default, flex tries to fit all flex items onto a single line, and that line can be a row or column. That means flex does not care about the size of the items. It only cares about the size of the container. So if the size of the flex items is too wide for their container, they will overflow it. To avoid this overflow and wrap items onto the next line, we use flex wrap property. Right? So if you have flex wrap activated and the size of the items is too wider than the size of the container, then there won't be any overflow. Flex items will wrap onto new line or multiple lines. So let me show you first the default behavior of the flex where it tries to fit all the flex items on a single line. Now we need to make some improvement in our code. First, I will put flex direction back to row. And now we are gonna give our flex container width. Let's say we have 900 pixel. Now the size of our container is 900 pixels and it has three flex items. Each item has a width of 100 pixels. So to create an overflow and to create the default behavior of the flex, we need to increase the width of our flex item. So let's say each flex item has a width of 400 pixels. Now you can see there will be definitely an overflow. The total width required by these three flex items is 1200 pixels. So the size of our flex items is too wider than the flex container. Now in the browser, you will see a result like this. This is our container, which is 900 pixels, and you see our flex items on a single row. Flex tries to do that. So Flex somehow has changed the width of our flex items so that they fit onto a single line. But there is an overflow, which is not visible here, but by using the developer tool, you can simply check it out. So let's open the developer tool. And now you can see the overflow. Item 1 is overlapping on item 2. Item 2 is on item 3. And a part of the item 3 is actually outside of the container, right? So you see an overflow. But you can also notice the size of our flex items is also changed, right? So flex has changed the width from 400 to 300 pixels, right? So you can see 300 pixels, 300 pixels. So that is the default behavior of the flex, and it always tries to fit items onto a single line. So to avoid this overflow, we have flex wrap property. The default value of this property is no wrap. What we want to do is we want to check the value wrap. Now you won't see any overflow and the items jump onto the new line. Let me refresh, and here you see the output. Each item has a width of 400 pixels and item number 3 wrapped onto the new line. That was all about flex wrap property, and it actually used together with the media queries to create responsive layouts. Let's move on. Our next container level property is align items. This one is also very interesting and gets used a lot. But before we study align items, I want to take you to a Flex reference guide that I use quite often. In a browser, you will simply search for CSS Flexbox CSS tricks. And here you have the result at the top, right? CSS Flexbox layout guide. So this is a Flexbox guide which I usually use when I teach Flex to my students or to look for the updates. So in the guide, as you can see, there are two columns, one to the left and to the right. The left column is dedicated to Flex container and the right one is to Flex items. So just like we have done in our course, Flex properties are divided into two different categories. The one is container and the other one is Flex items. In the left column, you will see all the container properties, their values, and one good thing here is visuals. You can also see the result of the property and the description. So if I scroll down, uh, I just want to show you the visuals of align items property. So this is the property we are gonna study. It can take 5 different values, as you can see: flex start and center, stretch, and baseline, whereas center and stretch are very commonly used values. And to get better understanding of this property, we actually need flex items with different heights. So let's go back to the code and see how do we work with this align items property. So in our code, we don't need flex wrap. So I'm gonna remove it from here. We can keep the size of the container to 900 pixels and the size of the items, we can change it to 200 pixels, right? And we'll disable the height from the divs. This height is explicit. It's hard coded. So when the explicit height is disabled, it goes back to auto. Auto means the height increases as we put more content in the element. So in the first div, let's say I will put some text, 10 words, and in the second div, 20 words, and in the third one, 30 words. So now our flex items have different height based on the amount of content they have. And the flex direction is set to row, and we can disable justified content space between for now so that our items sit near to each other. Now in the browser, you will see something like that, an amazing result. So what do we see here? Three flex items or three divs with different amount of content and no explicit height is applied on them. So when there is no explicit height on the flex items and the flex container has a height, then the flex item is gonna stretch themselves to fill the entire container. As you can see here, the size of the container and the size of the flex items. The output that you see here is very amazing and it was very difficult to accomplish in the past to create columns of same height, just like in a newspaper or product cards, several product cards with the same height. So Flex has made things much easier. Now the question is why we are seeing this stretch behavior. This is because of the align items property. Align items stretch is the default flex value. And to use it, there is a very simple rule. There shouldn't be any explicit heights on the flex items, and they will try to stretch to fill the container. So in our code, we did not put align items property, but it's there, and the value is set to stretch. And to change the value from stretch to others, then we need to code it. So let me now activate the justify content, and we can change the value to space evenly. And now I will put align items property. Value is stretch, like I said, is a default value. And we can also choose flex start. The stretch behavior is gone now, and you will see our divs have different heights. And they're going to place themselves on the horizontal plane because the direction is set to row and the space is divided evenly. So let me just refresh the page, and now you see the output. No stretch behavior, they have the original height, just like you see here in this first image. The flex end gonna place the items to the bottom of the container. So instead of flex start, we can also choose flex end. And now as we refresh, you will see our items gonna move to the bottom. And the value align item centers, like I said earlier, is the most used value. Here the items align themselves in the center of the container based on their height, not the content. So we can check it out, change the value to center, and now have a refresh. You will see the output. Now the last value to the align items is baseline, is a special one. Every content in a box has a baseline if you have a text. So right under the first line of the text, you will get the baseline. We won't see any difference in the output if we use the baseline because we have exactly the same content. But if you have different amount of padding in your boxes or flex items, or maybe the font size is different, then you will see an arrangement like this. You can do experiment by yourself to check the output of this value, baseline. So that was the align items property we just studied when the flex direction was set to row. What do you say about column? When the flex direction is set to column, the output would be different. So let's have a look at the align items property when the direction is set to column. And we will cover it very fast. So change the direction from row to column. And the first value is flex start. And I will also change the height of a flex container because I don't exactly know the total height coming from these divs. And I hope 500 pixels is enough. So now the flex direction is column, space is divided evenly, and the align items is set to flex start. So here's the output of the flex start. This is the start of the container when the direction is set to column, and now this is the end of the container. So if I change the direction from align items flex start to flex end, now you will see a different result. You will see our divs going to arrange themselves to the right side in a column. So let me refresh, and here you see the output. And the last value is align items center, and the center going to place this entire column exactly to the center of the container. Let's change the value to center, or refresh, and you will see the entire column to exactly the center of the page. That was the align items property. And here comes our bonus tips. Align items together with the justify content can put any box to exactly the center of the page. To put items to the center of the page or to the center of the container horizontally and vertically was also very difficult to accomplish before. But now using Flex or Grid, you can place any item to the center of the page very easily. So let me show you how do we do that. Let's say I have only one flex item or one box that I want to place exactly to the center of the page or the container, right? So I'm going to disable this piece of code. Now in the CSS, it doesn't necessarily have any specific direction. It will work for both column or row. All you need to do is turn justify content to center and align items also to center. Now here comes the tricky part. The container where you want to place the item to the center horizontally and vertically must have a defined height like we have here, right? So an explicit height is necessary. Page, if you see our div, which is the only child in the container, is exactly center aligned inside a flex container, right? So center alignment is not a big deal any longer. That was all about align items property. Let me first activate the code we deactivated earlier. Now, the next property on our list is align content, not justify content. The name of the property is align content, and this property might get you confused. But don't worry, I'm here to help you. I'm here to make things easier for you to understand. Let's consult with the Flex documentation. So here we have align content property, and we just studied align items. And before the align items, uh, we looked into the justify content. So we have two container level properties ending with content, justify content and align content. Justify content property we have already studied. What does it do? It distributes the leftover space among the flex items, right? And it can take six different values, as you can see here. Now scroll down to the align content property. Here you will see only one similarity between align content and justify content. Align content also accepts the same values as justify content, like the start and center, stretch, space between, and space around. So align content accepts the same values as justify content, but it does not do the same thing as justify content do. So what does align content do becomes pretty much clear when we look at the images. So what do we see here? We see a lot of flex items. Is there anything else? Yes, there is one more thing. These flex items are actually creating multiple flex item lines. As you can see, there are three lines of flex items. And that is where align content property comes in. It actually controls the spacing between the lines of the flex items. That means align content property will only work when you have two or more flex lines. Now you can relate and differentiate align content with justify content. Justify content controls the spacing between the items, whereas align content controls the spacing between the flex lines. So that is the main difference between these two properties. That was the background of this property. Let's now go back to the code and see this property in action. The first thing that we need here is multiple lines, and these three divs cannot make multiple lines, right? So we need to put more divs in our flex container like this. So now we have so many flex items. I don't exactly know how many, but they're enough to create multiple lines. Each flex item has a width of 200 pixels, and total width inside the container is 900 pixels. So there must be uh, an overflow. And you remember, to avoid the overflow and create multiple lines, what do? We activate the flex wrap on the container. And at the same time, we don't need align items, justify content. And we'll set the flex direction to row, right? Now we'll have multiple rows inside the container. So let me refresh the page, and here we see we got three flex lines, and there is no gap between the lines, and this is because of the align items stretch behavior, right? So this property is automatically activated on the flex system. And to deactivate the stretch behavior, we can change its value to something else. For example, flex start. So in our code, here we have align items property, which is set to center. We can change it to flex start. Now let's have a reload. Now you can clearly see we have three flex lines and there is some space in between. This space that you see here now can be controlled using the align content property. Let me show you the output of different values that we have in the guide align content. Flex start means all the rows at the top of the container, no space in between the lines. Flex end, all the rows to the bottom of the container. Center, all the rows, center. Stretch, gonna stretch the items. And here we have space between, space around. So let's apply some of them and see how do they respond. Now we're gonna code align content, right? Align content flex start. And we refresh. So you can see all the rows are pegged to the start of the container, just like the output we have here. And flex and gonna peg the rows to the bottom of the container. So let's reload, and now you can see rows to the bottom of the container. There are some more values. As you can see, we have stretch, center, space between, space around. Stretch is not going to work because we have explicitly given width to our flex items, which is 200 pixels. So that's why stretch is not going to work. But center can work, and space around or space between can also work. So let me show you the output of center. Now I have a reload. So you can see all the rows to the center of the container. And one final, we can also check space around. Now reload, and you see the output. So that was align content property, which controls the vertical spacing between the flex lines. And it can also be using together with justify content. Justify content controls the spacing between the items, right? So here we have items and here we have lines. So if I need some spacing between the items, I will activate the justify content and let's say space evenly, right? So I have a reload, and here we see the spacing between the items. In a nutshell, we can say to control the vertical spacing between the flex lines, we use align content property. And to control the spacing between the flex items, we use justify content property. That was all about align content property, and now we only have one property left to cover, which is gap, row gap, and column gap. As we are done with this property, we are done with all the container level properties. Let's dive into it and see how do we work with the gap property. Gap is a general property. It's not only for Flex. It can be used with CSS grid and multi-column layouts. And what does this property do? It actually lets you control the spacing between the Flex items and between the Flex lines. So gap is just another option to control the spacing between the Flex items or between the Flex lines. What other options do we have? Yes, we have justify content and we also have align content property. So there are so many properties to control the spacing between the items and the lines. Now the question is, when do we use gap property instead of justify content and align content? And this question is very important. We must know the difference between the properties and how do they work. So let me now give you the answer of this question. Just have a look at the diagram. So what do we see here? We see a flex container with three flex items and some leftover space. Gap property is already applied and you can see 10 pixels of gap between the columns. So after we have applied the gap, we still have this leftover space in the container. And that is the reason for using gap property. If this leftover space is important for you, then you will go for the gap property. Because here you will specify the gap value by yourself. Like in this example, 10 pixels of gap is applied in both directions. Now let's suppose instead of gap, you apply justify content on this container. Then you only have to choose among the 5 predefined values to control the spacing. Flex start, flex end, space between, space around, and space evenly. And the same is true for the align content property. So unlike gap property, justify and align content will utilize the entire space of the container in order to distribute it among the items. So that is a real difference between the gap and the other properties. Now, one last comment before we go ahead and code this property. The gap is actually shorthand for row gap and column gap, right? So when you only use a gap property, gap is applied in both the directions. Otherwise, you can use row gap and column gap. Let's now see the gap property in action. In our code, we need to disable the justify content property because now we are going to control the spacing using the gap property. And the align content will be set on flex start. And we also don't need the align items property. So let's disable it. Now you will see all the rows are pegged at the top of the container because align content is set to flex start. So let me refresh. And here you see, right? So all the rows are packed at the top of the container. Now we can apply the gap property because there is some leftover space in both the direction. The column gap is actually gap between the items and row gap is gap between the rows. So in our code, if I just apply gap 10 pixels, that simply means a space of 10 pixels in both the direction. So let me reload the page and here we see a gap of 10 pixels in both the directions. And instead of gap, as in the documentation, you can see we can also choose row gap and column gap. You can now apply and check the output of these two variations of the gap property by yourself. So my dear listeners, we have now covered all the container level properties and you have seen all of them in action. We talked about what to do, when to use them, and when to choose a property over another. Before we move on to the item level properties, I want you to solve these two exercises. And it's very important you apply some of the concepts you have learned up till now. In the first exercise, we have two boxes, outer box and inner box, and both the boxes are center aligned. The outer box is inside the body and the inner box is inside the outer box. And in the second exercise, you will create a 3-column layout where the columns have exactly the same height. So these are the two exercises I want you to solve, and if you find them difficult, check the description for the answer. Once you're done with the exercises, you can continue with the second part of this course where we will be covering item level properties. We will use the same code file and start exactly where we are leaving this tutorial. So I will see you in the second part of this course. Take care.